welcome to all viewers of Swarajya's Conversations on Atmanirbhar Bharat. Today's conversation is with Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, who is not only the External Affairs Minister, but is also the son of India's original strategic thinker, A. Subramaniam. So he has a pedigree, a long history of being there, doing that. He's been through the works, through the bureaucracy. He knows how diplomacy works, where the rubber hits the road, and now is in charge of the strategic thinking in the Ministry of External Affairs. So, elaborate introduction. So, before I start my discussion with him, I would like to request Mr. Pushpendra Singla, CFO of Zinc International, to say a few words so that we can get underway with the conversation. Mr. Singla.
Thank you very much, Mr. R. Jagannathan. Thank you very much, and very good morning, Honorable Minister Shri Jaishankar ji, and again very good morning, Mr. R. Jagannathan, and all the expert and panelists on the webinar. Firstly, I wish very good health and wellness for all of you, especially in the COVID unprecedented time. I wish you and your family remain safe and healthy. And I also take the opportunity to specially thank the Minister for taking his valuable time to address us today, and also the Swarajya team for taking this webinar initiative. More specifically, I say that in terms of our Prime Minister, our Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji has taken a vision of self-reliant India, the Atmanirbhar India. And we all are being an Indian citizen and being a part of India can play a vital and very critical role in terms of achieving this vision and converting this vision into the reality. More specifically, again, if I will get into that I personally believe, and as a Vedanta, we believe that the road to Atmanirbhar Bharat and self-reliant India will completely unleash India's potential in terms of its economic growth, in terms of job creation, the infrastructure development, social security improvement, and improved trade balance, specifically by reducing the import. The money which is going out of India in terms of imports can be reinvested back to India to develop our own infrastructure, to develop our own people, and to create employment for our own people and develop entrepreneurship within India. So I think that's a great potential, and that's a great initiative. And being an Indian citizen and being a part of India, it is our responsibility, and on the other side, it's our proud to be part of this initiative to be a Atmanirbhar Bharat.
Thank you, Mr. Singla.
Yeah.
Dr. Jaishankar, let me begin with your book, which is a good place to start. You have talked about multipolarity. After during the Cold War, we had two superpowers. Then we had a unipolar world. Then we moved into another situation of we are back to a situation where we have two superpowers, probably the US and China this time, and a whole lot of midi powers that are either already there or emerging, right? Now, this is a very complex scenario. How does a country like India, with its multiple challenges, deal with so many different kinds of powers with different interests and different economic strengths, deal with this multipolar world?
Before I come to the question itself, Mr. Jagannathan, let me first say what a pleasure it is to join you today. And I'm really happy to take part in a series which you call Atmanirbhar Conversations, because this was a Atmanirbhar minister writing his views. I mean, that book is written by me. Okay, there's no speechwriter involved. It is me speaking. You know, the views are mine, the mistakes are mine, the assertions are mine. And I did it because I actually, part of Atmanirbhar Bharat, I mean, yes, I accept a lot of it should be economic, but at the end of the day, it's a mindset, okay? And one part of that mindset is really to look at the world, be confident about what you are, where you are coming from, do your analysis of what is your interest, and then proceed accordingly. Now, to I have attempted it, okay? And I'm not by any way suggesting that it's either a perfect effort or the last word. In fact, I say that my idea is to provoke, is to start a debate, is to make people respond, okay? In fact, even in writing the book, I followed that method. I would go somewhere, make a speech or a discussion, make assertions, get audience responses, develop them, reflect in my own mind where I'm going. And the other part of it is also, and we can discuss that later, the cultural part of it, that we have a tradition, we have a history. We don't use it. We don't even remember it at times, which is why I spent a whole segment about what a great teaching the Mahabharata is. Teaching not only of ethics, but really teaching of statecraft, teaching of diplomacy, teaching of concepts which today, multipolar world, as you say, how do you, there were bipolar contradictions in Mahabharata which finally come to head. But the fact is, before the crisis comes, even the Mahabharata era has multipolar characteristics. But let me now fast forward to our era and answer your question. Okay, look, there has been a continuous rebalancing in the world, which started after the Second World War, and you saw it to some degree with the revival of Japan and Germany, then with the Asian tigers, then with Southeast Asia. Okay, we were late, but we've also now very much in the fray. So if you look, it's a very interesting chart. If you look at who were the top 10 economies 50, 60 years ago, who are the top 20 economies, and start looking at the changes, okay, you can see really the transformation which is happening in the world. And to my mind, at the end of the day, what is this rebalancing? It is new production centers and new consumption centers. And then the power consequences of that. So, yes, there are two very big polities. I mean, there is the United States, which I still would say is preeminent, even though its domination is reducing by the day.
Right.
But it's still, no question, it is the number one power. And again, no question, China is today the number two power, though there's a gap between 1 and 2. But we should not today stand in awe of 1 and 2 and say, oh, they are out there and there is the rest of us. We are a potential 3, maybe even higher with the passage of time. So let us, reflect on ourselves. Let us look at what are our achievements. Let us look at what are our shortcomings. So, I have a chapter which is a kind of an audit chapter. It's called The Dogmas of Delhi, where I've looked at 70 years of foreign policy and said, look, these are the good bits. These were where we came up short. And sometimes, yes, we came up short because those were the circumstances. But sometimes there were conscious choices, So, if you came up short in, say, Shimla in 1972, it was not predestined. It was a very deliberate decision. So, I would say today, if you look at the world and not buy into other people's analysis. Okay, so I again come back to Atmanirbharta. Don't buy into analysis of American declinism. Don't buy into analysis of China, which is sort of somewhere unstoppable. I think everybody has their sort of growth path. They will have their challenges, they will have their achievements. I mean, both countries, there much they have done which other polities will admire, in many cases emulate. They will also look at them and say, well, they are different and my pathway is different. So think through for yourself.
Yeah, one follow-up to this line of thought. Now, we know that some of the other entities we have to deal with are agglomerations like the European Union or ASEAN or whatever it is. But do you think our policy should be determined by the Union as a whole or with specific countries? Like, say, Germany is the eminent superpower within the European Union and probably France to a lesser extent, but there. So the rest actually don't matter. Same if you're looking at ASEAN, you probably need to look at maybe Malaysia and Indonesia and not the whole group as a thing, because the rest of them are just a bunch of yes and no types. So you don't really need to do that. So do you deal with countries or entire unions?
You know, I would differ with you very, very profoundly in what you said. And I'll tell you why. Because, in a sense, as a practitioner, I realize everybody matters. Sometimes, it's a little sort of pebble in your shoe can cause a big ache. So you may have a union, you may have a collective, but don't, I think in real life, when it comes to diplomacy, when it comes to negotiation, when it comes even to power calculations, I would not rule out, I would not rule out smaller players or, say that the dominant player of a collective, it's like, a small shareholder in a company. Depends how they use their share, what they do with it, how they leverage it. So I think world is a little more granular and complicated than your remark would suggest. Yes, we have to deal with collectives, because at the end of the day, a collective is also a reality. So let's take an example. I mean, today I have EU, okay? I deal with Brussels, but I also deal with the 27 national governments. And maybe naturally, if they are bigger economies or more influential countries, I will deal with them more. So it's very rarely in life is it an either or. It's mostly all of the above kind of situation.
Right. Let me come to some of the economic aspects of things. One is there are two components primarily of power. One is the economic component, and the other is the military and harder elements of power. Like India probably is midi on both fronts, and whereas let's say if you say Russia is a harder military power than an economic power, China is both, America is both, but Germany is probably a harder economic power than military power. So the point is, when you come to that, let us look at India. We have not done too well on FTAs and other things, which would actually make her much stronger on the thing. We have also opted out of RCEP for probably good reasons, and all the confrontation of the border tell us why we were probably right. But the point is, how do we actually make use of these FTAs to become much stronger economically so that the military power can also be projected equally strongly?
Well, my view is FTAs by themselves are not bad. Okay. In fact, how good or bad they are, the fault is not with the FTA. The fault is what are the terms that India has negotiated. Okay. If you negotiate a good FTA and advantageous FTA, obviously you'll speak well of FTAs. If you have not done well in your negotiations and the terms are loaded against you, then you have a dim view of that FTA. So a lot of it is really our FTA experience, And the fact is, many of our FTAs, when you look back, especially when you look back, it's very evident we could have done a much better job. And you mentioned RCEP, for example. If you take the RCEP countries, and by the way, we had FTAs with everybody in the RCEP group except China, Australia, New Zealand. Okay? So the others with everybody else, because you had ASEAN, you had Japan, you had Korea. Now, our trade deficit in the last decade has gone up from about $43 billion, if my memory is right, to $110 billion with the FTA countries, with the RCEP countries. Now, a lot of that is this is correlated with the period when there is an FTA. Hmm? So, but don't just go by the figures. Go by what you and I know as normal people living in Indian society. When we look at our economy, and if you are not a very theoretical person, you mix around, you move around, you talk to business people. The fact is, our small businesses have been very badly hurt by imports. Fact is, our manufacturing has not developed the way we all thought it would 20 years ago, because in many ways the component industry was made non-competitive by imports. So, and all of this had huge employment consequences in this country. So if you I think there is a very valid school of thought which actually says, hang on a bit, let's look at this very clinically, very coolly. Has this really worked for us? The FTAs which are already there, should we not be pressing for their review, because they are supposed to be reviewed? Many of them have not been reviewed. And should we be entering into more FTAs with the similar kind of set of partners, which would make an already difficult problem more complicated? Now, in the case of RCEP, we had a certain, we had certain specific concerns which we wanted addressed. They were not addressed. So it was not on a whim or a caprice that we decided, okay, we are not going to join. There was a lot of diligence and a lot of thought which went into it. And finally, the judgment was made by Prime Minister in 2019, saying that, look, the terms which have eventually kind of come out of the negotiations do not justify our joining this arrangement. I think it was a very self-confident decision not to say yes, because a normal situation, you get pressurized into joining something because you've been part of the negotiation.
Right. Given that geopolitics, economic underpinnings of that cannot be separated today, what is the kind of capacity building that you see that the MEA and the whole diplomatic corps needs to do to work into a higher level of competence in understanding trade issues? So far, I think its diplomacy has almost been separate, and the Commerce Ministry used to handle the trade issues. But do you find these two actually working closer and developing cross capabilities?
Well, that's not exactly how it is on the ground. First of all, if you look at the field I'll start with the field. On the field, we have commercial officers, okay? Now commercial representatives. Now commercial representatives, there are two broad categories: those who are actually formally commercial representatives paid for from the Ministry of Commerce budget. And in many embassies which are new, where they didn't have those, but from the MEA we took people and told them, no, you will do commerce because our economic interests are so important. Now, even the ones which are on the commerce budget are largely manned by foreign service officers because they need language skills. They need the ability to understand societies, to be networked, to operate in a foreign environment. So, first of all, on the field, wherever, whoever is paying for it, whoever is the line of command, the actual job there is being done by professional diplomats. So we have today, if you look at diplomacy, not today, I in part of my career, after I had done a few political jobs, the moment I kind of got to the middle level, I opted for a commercial job. I was a commercial counselor in Hungary. Most people in the foreign service at some point in the career have done and would like to do economic and commercial jobs. It is part of your overall understanding. Now, how does it work at headquarters? Here, what has happened is, part of it is at the bureaucratic level, that the Foreign Ministry, the Commerce Ministry, the Finance Ministry, the other line ministries. Remember, it's not only commerce. I'm discussing, say, pharmaceutical, or I'm discussing steel or whatever it is. But particularly in this government, there is because see, the team the team spirit is very strong in this government. So the ministers of this government, sort of spend a lot of time. There is very, very tight networking and group think on this. We debate a lot of things. We meet very, very regularly. So, on a lot of these issues, I mean, whether it is Piyush Goyal ji or Nirmala Sitharaman ji, or depending on, what the line interests are, Dharmendra Pradhan, if it is steel. But
Oil.
we would meet, we would talk, we would debate, and we would come to some kind of a collective position. So now,
Yeah.
if you ask me, should we have more people do this? Of course. Should we have a larger foreign ministry? Absolutely. But I have to be realistic. I live in a country, I can't push my interest to the exclusion of other people. So my growth and development will reflect the larger systemic growth and development.
Right. Let me put you in a tight situation. Now we have, when you talk about trade, given the recent eyeball to eyeball on the border, do you see the possibility that we might have to have one free, which is to be the EU or ASEAN, or where we might want to open up trade more, but a more in the Sainik area, direct trade? Do you, because that's what we're doing? More strongly. So effectively, I'm seeing that we'll have a unidirectional, which is more towards the democratic nations, but probably a more fun with the other emerging superpower. Do you see this parallel track happening?
You were garbled a bit, so let me say the question to make sure I understood it right. You are really saying that given our current difficulties on the border with China, you are really asking me, do we have, in a sense, what should be our trade and economic nature of our trade and economic relations with China? I mean, that's the sense with which I understood your
And if I may
question.
say, do we need to expand trade interests in one direction and contract it in another?
Look, I think we shouldn't mix apples and oranges. We have a very serious situation on the border. Okay, we say that very openly. Why do we have that? Because we have the basis of our normalized relations with China is peace and tranquility in the border areas. And if we have agreements not to bring forces, not to mass forces, and those agreements today are not being observed, if the line of actual control is not being observed and respected, then clearly if that is the foundation of the development of the relationship, you have issues out there. But having said that, please bear in mind, our trade problems with China have, are much sort of earlier than the developments of last year. I mean, when I went as ambassador to China in 2009, we were already raising market access issues. So the dynamic of that is quite different from whatever is happening on the border. So, so what happens on the border obviously affects the development of the relationship. I'm not disputing that, but don't make it deterministic. Even if the border issue had not happened hypothetically, we still had very serious trade concerns with China, because the fact is we have struggled with market access out there. That we have found, sort of products and services which are competitive globally don't have market in China. So it's not that we are non-competitive, because if my IT industry or my pharma industry is succeeding in the EU, it is succeeding in ASEAN, it is succeeding in the United States, why is it not succeeding in China? It can't be right everywhere else in the world but wrong in China. So I have issues, and I think we have been engaged with the Chinese in trying to make progress on some of these issues. And by the way, I must say, it was not that they denied that. I mean, we were actually trying to see how the market access issue could be better addressed. Unfortunately, we have not made serious progress out there.
Yeah. The other thing, one reason some economists feels why we have been failing on FTAs is because we have not been good at erecting non-tariff barriers. Do you think that's an area where we need to work on, or do you think that formal increases in duties are the best way to do it?
Look, you are taking me out of my zone of comfort because at the end of the day, I'm a
Yeah.
foreign minister. I'm not the commerce minister. So I
Right.
think you get Piyush ji for a conversation and ask him that
Yes.
question.
Yes. Okay. I did ask him that also, but I thought I'll ask his counterpart who is doing the diplomatic part whether he believes this is the way to do it.
Well, I
Okay.
can give you the answer. I agree with Piyush ji's answer.
That's a true diplomat. That's a true diplomat. Right. Okay. I come to defense. In defense, actually, we have been highly dependent on imports for a large part of our equipment. Only recently that shift has changed. We have now said we will order Tejas from Indian things. A lot of rifles, there's various things are now going to be domestically produced. No? So does the MEA now dovetail into these plans where at some point you will also become a major exporter of military equipment? Apart from Atmanirbharta, you're also going to be an export base. Is that something that's going to be likely?
Well, let me sort of, in a sense, bring out what is the MEA's role in terms of our defense industry. I think the primary role for Indian diplomacy is to first create the access that whether it is in procurement of products or whether it is in accessing of technology. MEA's responsibility is to see whether with a country X or a country Y, it is possible to do that there are no policy impediments, there are no regulatory impediments. So a lot of what we do has been really to open the door, so to speak. Now, sometimes you can open the door, for a country, but within the country, there may be levels of technology. I mean, especially say with the United States, what kind of technology their policy system will clear for India, you are trying to constantly improve. Other countries, Russia or France, they don't have such structured differentiation. So it's a different kind of exercise out there. So our job at the end of the day is to, as I say, make sure that the doors are open and stay open. And particularly on at times of stress or at on projects of priority, that it is even more forthcoming. Now here, if I say so myself, I think over many years, I mean, nothing to do with just my tenure, I mean, for many years, MEA has delivered on that. I mean, there are not many countries in the world who could say, yes, I am able to access in Russia, I'm able to access in Europe, I'm able to access in America, I can go to Israel. So we've really, I would say, pretty much opened up the world. Now, we take it for granted in this country, as though that's something which happens by itself. This is not so. I mean, many countries are not able to get technology and products from many suppliers for political reasons or regulatory reasons. After all, even with the United States, for many years, we were not, we were reluctant to buy and they were reluctant to sell for policy reasons. So the first is this. The second part of what you are saying, what happens when we start producing? I think now you have the reverse dynamic. Now, as a producer, you want to go out there and open up the doors of a potential market. I think that is a challenge which has come upon us. We are already grappling with it in certain areas. we would, whether it is actually the transactions or whether it is even events like Aero India, etc., we would, our job would be again to facilitate, to work with the Ministry of Defense to make sure that they sort of, make the right pitch to the right people, and, there's a good understanding of what we have to offer. So,
Right.
in many ways, I would say vis-a-vis the world, whether it is trade, whether it is investment, whether it is defense, we are the mediums of interaction. And our job is, we are the delta on every ministry which makes the difference.
Right. Okay. If I have just last 5 minutes, I can ask you two more questions before we conclude. One is, SAARC has been stillborn because of Pakistan, right? If I may be blunt about it. But there's no reason why we can't say have much deeper relationship with some of the rest, like whether with Nepal, we already have a trade in transit. What about the possibility that you can do something similar with, say, a Bangladesh or a Sri Lanka, who are the other major economies here? So that, many Indian businesses are actually shifting their enterprises to Bangladesh, because I think they feel that production laws and entries into other markets are easier there through the thing. Like, is there a way that our economic relationships with the two other big economies in the region, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, can move to some kind of a wider free trade zone?
Well, first of all, we need to be clear why SAARC is in the situation it is today. The primary reason is, of course, that Pakistan practices cross-border terrorism. So, if you look anywhere in the world, look at any collective grouping, EU, ASEAN, Mercosur, you don't have one member of the group openly practicing terror against another member of the group. Okay? So, I am actually astonished how long we have put up with this.
That's right.
That we actually, by our lack of adequate response, we normalized it, which in my view was a very, very serious
mistake.
error. But put that aside. Yeah. Okay. But what does regionalism mean? Regionalism means more trade. Okay. Pakistan was not giving us MFN. Regionalism means connectivity. They were not allowing connectivity. Okay. It meant, movement of people. They were very tough on visas. So they were actually, this whole regionalism was a very one-way kind of activity for, where India and Pakistan were concerned. Now, it matters are where they are. So let's look now, as you say, what happens with the others. See, with the others, in some cases, it can be bilateral. In some cases, there are other avenues like BIMSTEC, etc. In some cases, some of these are coming, after all, the preferential trade aspects of SAARC still apply to the others. The point is that we have made really a very big effort in the last 6 years, strengthening connectivity, creating sort of easier movement of goods and people, with all our neighbors. So if you look at the examples you're talking about. Today, Nepalese goods have more routes to go through India to ports than they did before. We have a better ability to transit Bangladesh than we did before. We have agreements, and Bangladesh has been particularly a notable case here, where, we have been able to use their ports. It has been to their benefits as well. So even, we have our states to the east of Bangladesh have benefited, because very often that ability to transit has been helpful there. So we are very, very committed. Even if, put SAARC aside for the moment in a formal sense, We are very committed to promoting regionalism, to promoting intra-regional connectivity and capability. Because what is the vision which underpins this? The vision which underpins this is really that India's growth and prosperity should be a larger lifting tide for the entire region. You know, if our neighbors believe that their lives have become better because they are linked to us, believe me, their view of us will be very different. So it is today a very, very generous, non-reciprocal, a very forthcoming, proactive policy. We have done more in the last 6 years in connectivity than you can possibly imagine.
Coming specifically to Nepal and Bangladesh, where we have seen some deterioration in the quality of our relationship. Nepal due to the map issue, Kalapani issue, and in Bangladesh due to the post-CAA, flap over that. Now, do you see these coming back to normal, or is it still a little strained?
No, look, Mr. Jagannathan, we have our politics, they have their politics. I mean, everybody has their politics. When you're in a democracy, you have competitive politics within a country also. So, rather than get caught up in the momentary issue, because I think this kind of ball by ball commentary of foreign policy is not a very good way of analyzing it. Okay. Of course, there will be balls where you will not score a run, but you have to look at partly the trend line, and partly you have to look at actually what is the structural connect out there. I mean, you are talking of Nepal. Now, I'm not saying that the boundary issue is not an issue, but I'm putting it to you that if you look today at Nepal, you look at today the power situation in Nepal, you look at the fact that we've been able to create a fuel pipeline which has enormously lowered their energy costs. You look at the fact that at various levels, whether it is new roads or checkpoints, the ability of people to move up and down has improved. Or you look at Bangladesh, look at the number of projects which are coming up in Bangladesh. I would say the pluses to my mind, far outweigh everything else. So I mean, if I were to say where were we in total terms with Nepal, say 6 years ago or 10 years ago, and where are we today? I would very confidently assert that with all our neighbors today, with the exception of Pakistan, that our relationship is today in a very, very much better place.
So, in one word, if you were to look at our biggest challenge now, that is China right now. What is China? Friend, foe, frenemy, or something? All three?
I would say in one word, if you ask me what is our challenge, it is us. It is our ability to muster that self-confidence and that, ambition to sort of go up in the world. There will be competitors. I mean, after all, the world is a competitive place. Why would other countries not compete with you? And why would, if you are a sort of a large civilizational state of 1 billion people, it is people are not going to ignore you. You will always be in other people's calculations. So my point is, we should not get over obsessed with that. We should treat that as par for the course. World will compete. The bigger you become, the more you rise, the tougher the competition is going to be. Now we have to learn, as I come back to the start of your question, this is a multipolar world. So there will be no protection by taking sides, So you have to leverage the world to the best of your ability. So I would say believe in yourself. I think that is why I liked the fact that you have Atmanirbhar conversations.
Right. Have we actually developed an India way as of now?
I think it's work. I hope it's work in progress.
Okay. Thank you,
Okay.
Dr. Jaishankar, for being very candid
thank you
and
very
for
much.
giving us a lot of time. And I appreciate it. Thanks a lot for Singla and all the audience who have been able to hear. I think the minister has a busy schedule, so I need to conclude. And as promised, though he has managed to graciously extend it by 10 minutes more than he agreed to. So I think, thank you, Dr. Jaishankar. Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody, for being here. Thank you. Thank you.